The principle of being governed by consent posits that legitimate political authority relies entirely on the approval of the population. A social contract sustained financially through compulsory taxation that funds the comprehensive machinery of the state. This system is maintained via diverse fiscal levies, including income tax, council tax, and indirect duties, which collectively finance local municipal councils, emergency services, the National Health Service, national security forces, intelligence agencies, the judiciary, legislative remuneration, travel, parliamentary allowances, second homes, bar alcohol bill, and royal expenditures. Within this financial structure, cash distribution and public budgets frequently encounter systemic inefficiencies, including extensive financial wastage, poor fiscal management, bureaucratic overspending, failed auditing protocols, fraud, and the misappropriation of the public purse. For such a system to persist, it requires the continuous compliance of the governed, despite a well-documented divergence between the idealized ideological narrative of public service and the empirical reality of the lived experience on the ground. Organizational psychology and sociological research indicate that institutional frameworks frequently attract individuals with specific behavioral traits, where positions of coercive authority appeal to personalities prone to dominance, enforcement, or self-aggrandizement within roles such as law enforcement, politics, the judiciary, and corrections. Consequently, the official sales pitch presented to the public contrasts sharply with ground-level realities, where documented instances of institutional misconduct, such as aggressive policing, the mistreatment of vulnerable or restrained individuals, unfulfilled political mandates, judicial or correctional corruption, and organizational deviance, reveal systemic vulnerabilities. Universal organizational traits across public governance further exacerbate these dynamics, characterized by institutional negligence, deceptive practices, pervasive groupthink, the diffusion of responsibility through bureaucratic refrains like, "It's above my pay grade," and internal workplace bullying. When individuals attain positions of authority and undergo profound behavioral degradation due to unchecked power, psychological and criminological literature identifies this phenomenon through frameworks such as hubris syndrome, acquired situational narcissism, or general power corruption, describing a structural transformation where public servants lose empathy, accountability, and ethical boundaries toward the populace they are mandated to serve. Building upon the psychological profile of public sector employment, institutional frameworks also accommodate individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions such as autism spectrum disorder, a complex clinical condition characterized by a broad spectrum of traits traditionally grouped into social-emotional communication differences and restricted, repetitive behaviors or interests. Focusing specifically on social communication and interaction, autistic individuals often process and navigate social dynamics differently than neurotypical populations, encountering challenges with social-emotional reciprocity, nonverbal communication cues like eye contact and body language, and the dynamic maintenance of relationships, frequently resulting in the use of masking or camouflaging to fit into neurotypical environments. Critically, public perceptions that autistic individuals lack empathy or disregard the impact of their actions often stem from fundamental differences in neurodivergent information processing and theory of mind, the intuitive capacity to simulate another person's unstated perspective, predict emotional subtext, or decode subtle micro-expressions and tone of voice. While outward behavioral outcomes, such as appearing indifferent to someone else's distress, can superficially resemble the behavioral manifestations of psychopathy or emotional detachment, an autistic public servant may appear unconcerned simply because they genuinely missed the implicit emotional context rather than exhibiting malice. Nevertheless, when public institutions comprise a complex admixture of individuals with severe personality disorders, neurodevelopmental divergence, and unmitigated power dynamics, the cumulative effect creates profound systemic problems for canyons of governance, resulting in organizational rigidity, communication failures, administrative alienation. Compounding these behavioral and neurodevelopmental variables within public institutions is the widespread presence of emotion-suppressing pharmaceutical interventions among an undisclosed proportion of personnel across government, military, law enforcement, and intelligence sectors. Driven by chronic occupational stress, trauma, or clinical requirements. A segment of the ruling apparatus relies on medications, such as antidepressants, mood stabilizers, or neuroleptics, that artificially blunt affective processing, diminish emotional resonance, and fundamentally alter subjective human experience. Consequently, the structures of governance are increasingly populated by individuals who not only harbor complex personality disorders or neurodivergent profiles, but are also chemically insulated from the full spectrum of human feeling experience by the broader population. This pharmacological detachment merges with pre-existing institutional traits, resulting in a ruling class that operates with a profound detachment from the lived realities, emotional burdens, and daily struggles of the unmedicated majority they oversee, further reinforcing an administrative apparatus that functions entirely divorced from genuine empathetic feedback. In addition to these psychological, neurodevelopmental, and pharmacological variables, human biology introduces fundamental physiological dynamics that influence emotional stability, notably the female menstrual cycle, and its associated hormonal fluctuations. Driven by regular cyclic variations in estrogen and progesterone levels across the infradian rhythm, biological females experience recurring physiological shifts that directly interact with neurotransmitter systems, stress pathways, and emotional regulation centers in the brain. While these hormonal shifts are a universal component of human biology, clinical and endocrinological research documents that substantial drops or imbalances in these hormones can precipitate premenstrual symptoms, including acute mood swings, heightened irritability, anxiety, and transient emotional volatility. When viewed within the broader spectrum of human behavioral variability, these innate biological rhythms represent yet another complex layer of emotional and psychological fluctuation that interacts with individual temperament, workplace stressors, and systemic pressures across society. Building upon these institutional dynamics, the composition of public governance is further shaped by diverse motivational archetypes, ranging from individuals driven by an appetite for power, control, financial accumulation, and adherence to sectarian, religious, or secret society doctrines, to the contrasting minority who enter public service devoid of such acquisitive or self-serving ambitions. Within this complex landscape, human actors frequently prove susceptible to corruption and various reward-driven incentives, whether financial, sexual, or biological, leading to scenarios where individuals compromised by misconduct or clandestine activities will readily sacrifice public welfare to preserve their own positions. Behind closed doors and away from public scrutiny, political figures often demonstrate fluid ideological loyalties, shifting between factions while engaging in covert patronage networks designed to secure positions of authority, subsequently rewarding allies with lucrative appointments, financial enrichment, political favors, and willful institutional blindness. Furthermore, within majoritarian political systems, national direction is frequently dictated by the specific ideological frameworks of ruling factions, whether driven by religious, nationalist, or secular philosophies, while the electorate is often incentivized to vote along rigid tribal or identity lines rather than empirical societal benefit. Consequently, the overarching political machinery frequently manifests as a stagnant, cyclical phenomenon characterized by recurring iterations of conflict and structural continuity, wherein the fundamental distribution of power remains unchanged while the administrative control mechanisms governing society steadily expand. Given these persistent institutional dysfunctions, the traditional framework of majority rule governance based on active public consent faces a profound crisis of legitimacy, as growing segments of the population increasingly withhold compliance and challenge the validity of the social contract. To understand how large-scale coordination operates or how alternative arrangements might function, organizational theory examines distinct structural models. Hierarchical systems rely on top-down chains of command where authority, decision-making, and resource allocation concentrate at the apex, whereas distributed systems operate through decentralized networks of autonomous nodes where information and control flow horizontally without a single point of failure or central bottleneck. Bridging these paradigms, hybrid systems combine distributed flexibility with hierarchical coordination, utilizing decentralized local units for adaptive problem-solving while maintaining structured oversight for macro-level scale. Within these architectures, autonomy defines the inherent capacity of individual units or groups to self-govern their internal operations independently. Consequently, separate hierarchical structures can coordinate as a federated union toward a common purpose in a distributed manner, allowing diverse groups to collaborate horizontally, share resources, and maintain shared objectives without submitting to a coercive, centralized monolith. History books are replete with the chronicled cycles of rising and falling control structures, documenting how empires inevitably overextend themselves through hierarchical concentration and elite extraction, echoing the struggles of generations past who shed blood to secure individual liberties. Throughout history, the recurring pattern involves ruling classes growing detached from the populace, increasingly treating citizens not as sovereign human beings with inherent dignity, but as human resources or economic units to be managed, taxed, and manipulated. Given that human existence is fundamentally finite, granting each individual only one brief span of life, sociological critiques argue that people should not have to spend their lives being exploited, monitored, and governed by administrative systems and unfamiliar authorities to whom they have never granted explicit consent. From the perspective of the governed, a critical realization emerges regarding the mechanics of power. The entire administrative, coercive, and political apparatus relies entirely on compliance, meaning that for a structural transformation to occur, the populace need only recognize its collective majority and unified potential. Quantitative data regarding England and its governing infrastructure starkly illustrate how vastly outnumbered the controlling apparatus is by the general public. Specifically, the total population of England stands at approximately 58.6 million citizens, whereas the active instruments of state enforcement and administration represent a minuscule fraction of that total. For instance, the total strength of the UK armed forces is approximately 182,000 personnel. The full-time equivalent police workforce across England and Wales accounts for roughly 147,700 officers, and the core UK Civil Service Administration comprises around 524,000 personnel, alongside 650 elected members of Parliament. When these enforcement and governance sectors are aggregated, they total roughly 854,000 individuals, representing barely over 1% of the total population of England, vividly demonstrating that the governing machinery subsists entirely through voluntary compliance and psychological acquiescence rather than physical supremacy. This structural imbalance underscores how the contemporary apparatus of state control subsists entirely on voluntary compliance and psychological acquiescence rather than physical supremacy, operating through a fragile social consensus maintained by an administrative and enforcement minority of roughly 854,000 individuals. Within this insular machinery, an unquantified proportion of personnel, harboring varying degrees of dark triad personality traits such as psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism, alongside undocumented sexual deviance, neurodevelopmental variations like autism, or reliance on emotional suppressing pharmaceutical interventions, wield disproportionate power over the unconsenting populace. Because the structural integrity of governance relies entirely on the internalized submission and behavioral conditioning of the citizenry, this administrative class exercises outsized influence, effectively dictating the economic, social, and personal parameters of millions. Consequently, the lived reality experienced by the governed is one where a fractional minority, insulated by institutional shielding and psychological detachment, routinely compromises the well-being of the wider population, exploiting a system whose ongoing operation is sustained solely by the unwithdrawn cooperation of the majority. Building upon the mechanics of voluntary compliance and psychological acquiescence, the governance of a vast majority by a heavily outnumbered minority is frequently sustained through sophisticated social engineering and psychological conditioning designed to systematically drain public resistance. Within this framework, sociological analyses point to complex policy variables, such as large-scale migration management, uneven allocation of state resources, and perceptions of disparate legal enforcement or two-tier policing, where public dissent, emotional expressions of frustration, or protests are met with severe punitive measures and disproportionate legal penalties. This environment fosters a pervasive cycle of public fear, anxiety, and frustration that, over extended periods, induces chronic exhaustion and diminishes the capacity for collective organization. These societal pressures are maintained to weaken the populace, ensuring that the governing minority retains authority without requiring overt physical supremacy. As a strategic contingency, when domestic compliance frays or public discontent reaches critical thresholds, historical and geopolitical frameworks suggest that nations are frequently steered toward external conflicts, serving to distract the populace, facilitate the implementation of restrictive laws behind closed doors, and physically reduce or exhaust the population.